Hi, Emily here from Homemade Emily Jane, and today I'm very excited to share with you a tutorial for quilting the triangle grid quilting design. This is a very simple quilting design that involves just 3 sets of straight lines. So if you're comfortable quilting straight lines, this is a fun way to jazz up your next quilting project. Let me show you exactly how I do it on this sample quilt. This is my baby size paradigm quilt. You can find the pattern for this quilt in my shop at homemadeemilyjane.com. This is a simple motif that adds some amazing texture to any quilting project. If you're ready to get started, let's dive on in with your supplies list. For pretty much any straight line quilting technique, you're going to need all of the same supplies. So definitely a quilt top that's ready to be quilted, batting and backing to make your quilt sandwich. You're going to want to baste those together using spray adhesive, safety pins, or your preferred basting method of choice. I have a tutorial right here all about basting your quilt if you want to check that out. I also recommend a long quilting ruler and a hair marker for marking your quilting lines. This is one of my favorite sewing tools for marking lines on a quilting project. If you don't have one of these and you're eager to get started, a butter knife might also do the trick. And finally, I highly recommend a walking foot for your sewing machine. This will make the quilting process so much easier. It's also helpful to use quilting gloves while quilting. You'll see while I'm quilting, I like to wear quilting gloves just to make it a little bit more grippy as you move the quilt through the machine to guide it without your fingers slipping all around. I'd love to share a few general tips for straight line quilting. The first one is to mark your lines using your preferred marking method. I prefer the hair marker. Use a walking foot. Use quilting gloves, and of course make sure that you have a consistent stitch length. So for piecing, you typically use a smaller stitch length than I would for quilting because of the height of the quilt with more layers. So I normally go for somewhere around a 3 on my sewing machine for that stitch length. But the key here is to really try to make it consistent, and the walking foot will help. And finally, if you've never quilted anything before, I highly recommend quilting a practice project, a smaller project, just to get the hang of it before you dive into actually quilting your first quilt. So that could be a mini quilt, a pillow cover, something like that, just to practice the motif that you're going to be quilting. All right, let's cover the basics for getting started. Before you can actually sit down at your sewing machine and start quilting, we need to prep our quilt. So you're going to want to baste your quilt, plan your design, and mark your lines on your quilt. The triangle grid quilting that I'm going to be doing on this baby quilt today is going to be with lines spaced just 1 inch apart. It's actually a pretty dense motif when you do 1 inch apart. So I recommend that if you want it to go a little bit quicker, you might space it out a little bit further. 1.5 inches or 2 inches apart is also amazing. You could even go up to 4 or 5, maybe even 6 inches apart as well. Just make sure that your batting is sturdy enough to withstand the bigger quilting. For your triangle grid quilting, we start with just 1 set of straight lines. So this is really easy. If you've done straight line quilting before, you're going to just mark that first set of lines. So for me, I'm doing them 1 inch apart, and I'll show you that marking process right now using my hair marker and my long ruler. So you'll see I line up the ruler exactly where I want it to be. I'm using this line actually as a guide for this next line. And then I hold the ruler down and I press the hair marker in, just gently creating a tiny little crease of a line. Those are amazing because you can see them while you're quilting, but you don't have to worry about them washing out or sticking for too long. So I'll just finish up the last few lines here. I still have some more marking to do here. So I'll start at the center and work my way out. As we are quilting, we're going to use that same process, starting with these lines towards the center of the quilt and working our way towards the edges. That will just help in case there are any puckers or anything, any issues that come about from basting, so that we can address those as we go. If you're like me and use safety pins to baste, it's fun. It's actually a lot easier to mark before basting, before using the safety pins, or you can just kind of gently flip the safety pin out of the way as you're marking. Once you've marked all of the lines across your entire quilt using your desired spacing, mine is 1 inch apart, the next step is to bring that quilt over to your sewing machine and we'll start quilting those simple straight lines. Now I'm at my sewing machine. You'll see I have my walking foot on already and I need to thread my machine and wind a bobbin using this silk finish cotton thread by Metler. It is 40 weight thread, so it's a little bit thicker than what I typically use for piecing, so that it just gives it a little bit more texture and it really pops. And I picked a color that matches the background fabric for my quilt. Now my machine is threaded and I get to get my quilting gloves on and start quilting. Now if you've never done straight line quilting before, definitely just take it slow. I have a personal preference for how I do it and I'll explain it to you. So you see how all my lines are up and down. I like to do one basting stitch around the top edge. So for this quilt, any edge could be the top edge, but I'll pick this edge to be my top edge and I'm just gonna stitch super close to the edge of the quilt top. I'll turn my machine to a longer stitch length. I'm gonna do 4 just because this is a basting stitch to hold it all in place. Alright, now that I have that anchor stitch set, we're going to start quilting our lines on the quilt. As I mentioned earlier, we start in the center and we work our way towards the edges. So I'll start here in the center and stitch this way, and then I'll flip the quilt around and start and do that way. I am going to change my stitch length to 3.5 or 3 for the quilting. So I just start here in the center, make sure my gloves are on, and begin quilting my lines. Make sure to go real slow for the first couple to get the hang of it. You start off of the quilt, so I'm about 1/2 inch off of the quilt top, just in case there's any thread nest on the bottom so that doesn't end up visible. And just as a note, the more precise you are with this first set of lines and the second set of lines, it makes that third set of lines for this triangle grid quilting a lot easier. Now, one thing about pin basting, if you choose to do so, make sure you remove the pins long before you have any chance of running over them. So I just take the safety pin out and keep going. When you get to the end, you can fix your stitch, back stitch, or just stitch off the edge, like that. Now, if you are new to quilting on your home machine, I highly recommend that you stop every few lines or every section and just check out the back and make sure that it looks like what you're expecting, that you don't have any puckers or like any fabric folded and stitched in the wrong place. So take the whole quilt out and just take a quick little inspection before you keep going. It'll save some headache on the back end if you do need to rip out any seams. If everything looks good and as you were expecting, you can go ahead and just keep quilting. So now I've finished from the center of the quilt to one edge, and I'm going to rotate the entire quilt so that I can stitch the other half. And before I do, I'm going to go ahead and just do a basting stitch just along the edge of the quilt. So you'll see it's the bottom of those lines that I just sewed, but it'll be the top for this part, so it helps to have that anchor. And now I rotate the quilt, so now I can start at the center again and stitch from this line all the way to the edge of the baby quilt, and continue doing that same process, 1 inch apart lines for this quilt. Nice and repetitive. It's a great time to play a podcast or some music or just really get into your quilting zone. Now you'll see on mine that when I stitched over that initial anchor line this direction, it created a little pucker. I personally choose not to worry about that because this gets trimmed and put into the binding anyway. So if it's a little pucker like that, it's nothing to fret over. If it's a pucker in the middle of the quilt, that is when I try to like pay more attention, maybe rebase things if it's really bad. So just something to keep in mind and look out for. Once that first set of quilting lines are done, you'll just have simple straight lines all across your entire quilt. Now for your second set of quilting lines, you keep them the same distance apart. So for me, 1 inch, whatever you chose for the first set, you'll do that for the second and the third set as well. So your second set is going to be at a 60-degree angle. So it's super helpful if your long quilting ruler has the angle markings on it. This one has 60, 45, and 30. So I'm going to use the 60-degree line to give me a starting point for that angle. If your long ruler doesn't have it, see if any of your smaller rulers does have it, or even a equilateral triangle ruler will work to get you your first line, and then you can use a simple straight edge for the remaining lines. So that first line is what you use for like that angle, and then you kind of go from there for just straight lines, but this time at a diagonal. So let me show you how I mark that 60-degree line. Here's my ruler. 60 degrees are right here, these two X lines. So I'm gonna line up that 60-degree angle line with one of my straight lines on the quilt, or even a seam in the quilt as well. So as long as you have something to gauge that 60-degree line on, and then you actually mark the straight edge of the ruler. So there's 60 degrees between this line here and the edge of the ruler. So I marked that line, and then I need to make sure that I extend it down. So now I've got a long line marked right here, and I can just follow that line. I'm doing them 1 inch apart, so I move that line to the 1 inch and do another one here, and I'll do a few more. As it gets a little smaller and shorter, it gets a little bit easier. So you'll see I've got a series of lines here. Now to make sure that you use the right angle, the correct angle, you can also then, just as a test, draw a simple line crossing those lines and the seams that you already made, and that'll show you that triangle grid that you're going for. So just as a little test, you can see the third seam, or the third row of quilting that we're going to do, to see that your triangles are like the right shape, or the shape that you're looking for. There's no correct or right way to do this. It's really your creative freedom. So once you've kind of confirmed that this is the correct angle that we're going for, go ahead and mark those lines all the way across your quilt, just 1 inch apart, or however far apart your initial straight lines were. And then you'll be ready to quilt those straight lines just like we did the first set. So again, really repetitive, marking first, and then we'll quilt them. So I finished marking that second set of lines along that 60-degree angle across the entire quilt. Now I'm ready to quilt that set of lines. Because we've already quilted the entire thing with the straight lines, we don't necessarily have to start in the middle and work out. We're not really worried about shifting like we were previously. So you can start at one corner and work all the way over, or if you prefer, you can still start towards the middle of the quilt and work outward. It's really just personal preference at this point. So I will go ahead and get my gloves on and get started. And once you finish that second set of quilting lines, you'll have these beautiful diamond shapes. So I'll show you on the back. They really stand out with this thread color. you have these really pretty diamonds. So now let's talk about the third set of quilting lines to finish up our triangle grid quilting motif. So the last set of quilting lines is when we turn these diamond shapes into triangles, simply by stitching directly through each of the diamonds. So to do that, we have a couple different options. First off, you can mark your lines. So you can use the ruler and the hair marker or whatever method you chose for the first two sets of lines, and do that for this set as well. I will say, unless you are extremely precise on your first two sets of lines, it will be tricky to have this set actually be a true straight line. And that's because every little bit of like variance or wave in a line is going to adjust where you want to cut that diamond shape into a triangle. So what I personally prefer doing is kind of more of a winging it style. So I'll bring it to my sewing machine and I will simply just connect from one cross intersection of stitches to the next. So I'll show you what that looks like at the sewing machine, and just know that you have some options here. So as I mentioned, I do take more of a just like kind of winging it approach. The lines are going to intersect right where the stitches meet for each diamond shape. So where the first two lines cross, that's where we want the third line to intersect. My machine has this neat feature with a laser. The laser is really helpful because it kind of shows me where the stitches will go a couple inches in advance. You can do this without the laser as well, or you can add on a laser to your sewing machine. So if you don't have like a fancy machine with all the bells and whistles, that's one that you can add on. So I'll show you just as I start here. Again, starting off the quilt and then stitching on. So you'll notice as I'm going, I am making some slight adjustments to make sure that we stitch directly through the center. And you'll see now we're starting to see little triangles pop up, and we're going to do that across the entire quilt. I like to take this set of stitches a little bit slower than the other two, just to try to get it as perfect as possible with the points. You'll know that my first two sets of lines are not perfect. There are, of course, little variances. Some sets are maybe a tiny bit further apart than others. You can see right here, I missed the marking line by like maybe 1/8 of an inch. So it's not going to be 100% perfect, and that will result in some triangles just being a little bit smaller and some being just a little bit bigger. Ultimately, I think that's great. I really enjoy that little variance in this particular quilting motif, and I just cannot wait to see what this looks like once it gets finished quilting and I wash it for the first time to get that quilt crinkle. So I'll just go ahead and finish quilting this next set of lines, cutting through the intersection of the existing seams. So I kind of made a mistake here, I'll show you. In order to line up the stitching directly through the intersection, I kind of realized too late that I wasn't aiming for the right place, and I ended up kind of jig-jagging to the side. Ultimately, that's not going to be real noticeable once it's all quilted, so I'm just going to leave it. But a way to avoid that is to like really look ahead to where you're going so that you can smooth out any issues like that before they arise. So I hope as you go, you kind of get the hang of it, that you enjoy this process, and really enjoy the look of your triangle grid quilting. And once you finish that third set of quilting lines, you can flip the quilt over and take a look. You can see all the tiny triangles that we've just quilted. Thank you so much for joining me for this triangle grid quilting tutorial. If you found it helpful, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and of course subscribe to my channel. You can also find more quilting tips, tricks, and inspiration over at homemadeemilyjane.com or find me on Instagram at homemadeemilyjane. In the meantime, happy sewing!